Good morning, everyone. My name is LJ Stenbock. I'm the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte. Today, we have a wonderful, wonderful conversation planned with David Rennie. He is the Bureau Chief of the Economist of London in Beijing, China. And we're going to discuss how COVID-19 could reshape the global order. What a deep conversation and topic we have set up to have today. As you all know, and I would like to underline, World Affairs Council is a non-profit, non-partisan organization that focuses on promoting global education, on international affairs, and on critical events around the world that affect us here locally, regionally, nationally. As you also know, we're using the Zoom app today for our conversation. So please keep your microphone on mute and your camera turned off. There is a Q&A box in the Zoom toolbar, and you can see on the slide in front of you. So to submit a question to David at any time, please do use the question and answer box on that toolbar. This presentation will be recorded, and the video will be sent to you via the WACC mailing list. So please do make sure that you're signed up so you can receive our emails and this recording. Finally, we do have to share with you, as everyone, we are very much hurt by the COVID-19 situation. We do not have live events that are the mainstay of our activities and what we do here in the Charlotte community. We would love to have had David here in person, but this is the second best thing we can do. We do have our Zoom lectures. It is a free program, but please do consider making a financial gift to help support the work of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte. We only get financing from you, our members and supporters, and it is important at this time for us to be able to sustain our activities, our programming, and our work with schools and universities to have that financial support from you. So thank you for that, very much appreciated. David Rennie joined The Economist in 2007 as the European Union correspondent and Charlemagne columnist based in Brussels. From July 2010 to July 2012, he was British political editor and author of the Badge Health column based in London. In the summer of 2012, he moved to Washington, D.C., where David was the Lexington columnist from 2012 to 2017, and the Washington bureau chief from 2013 to 2018. In May 2019, David moved to China as Beijing bureau chief and launched the Chaguan column on China in September of 2018. Previously, David was on the foreign staff of the Daily Telegraph with postings in Sydney, Beijing, Washington, D.C., and Brussels. From 2006 until he joined The Economist of London, he was also a contributing editor of The Spectator magazine. He worked for the Daily Telegraph in London and the Evening Standard. David has given classes and public lectures on EU affairs at the universities of Harvard and Boston in the USA, Bristol University in Britain, and the business school ESCP Paris and IE in Madrid. He won the 2010 UACES Thomson Reuters Reporting Europe Award. David is a frequent guest on radio and television news and programs and speaks Chinese, English, French, and Spanish. Wow, congratulations, David. So David, you're now in Beijing. It is 10 o'clock in the evening. We're all very curious. Can you give us a rundown of your day? How do you spend your day in Beijing? How does it look? How is your family? Are you in quarantine? Can you tell us a little bit more about what you're experiencing right now in Beijing?
So in some sense, I'm talking to you from your future because we're about 2 and a bit months ahead of you. So we went through months and months of really very strict lockdown. I did weeks and weeks in all of quarantine, including about 3 or 4 weeks where I was literally not allowed to leave my apartment at all, and food had to be brought to the front door. and that was the kind of the peak of the quarantine. But now actually, Beijing is relaxing quite a lot. You still have to wear a face mask out in the streets. You get your temperature taken everywhere. We have these smartphone apps which you have to show a green code to get into most public buildings or to take public transport or to board a train or a plane. They're a bit glitchy, so one of the kind of big problems here is that your app can go wrong, you can't get it fixed, and so you're a bit stuck. So it's a slightly sort of dystopian kind of mix of technology and a kind of authoritarian state that's not always very efficient. Life is still pretty unusual for a lot of people. A lot of people can't get back into the country. There's about 35 foreign correspondents still stuck outside China because the borders are still closed to pretty much everyone except diplomats. That means, for example, I haven't seen my wife since December because she's stuck in Washington, D.C., and I may not see her for many more months because one of the things I'll talk about is that I think that China's strategy for containing and really suppressing the virus doesn't make it easy for them to open the borders. But otherwise, life is a lot easier now than it has been for a long time, and it feels more like normal life. It's hot here, it's summer, kids are out in the parks, people hid their kids away for a long time, they were scared. People are not scared. People are feeling that they've beaten this. As far as I can tell, there are no viral outbreaks anywhere in China. When small outbreaks start, they get crushed with fresh lockdowns. So probably, arguably, this is one of the safest places to be anywhere.
Thank you, David. Let's move on to your presentation. And thank you for giving us a glimpse of what the world looks like out from Beijing. Please go ahead.
Thank you, LJ. So I have been here since the beginning of this thing. I haven't left China this year, partly because I couldn't get back in. So I want to start by taking you to kind of really a couple of days after China locked down that epicenter city and province. So Wuhan, the city, in the middle of the province of Hubei. That's a province of 60 million people. So that's about the population of the UK or Italy. And they locked that down on about the 23rd of January. So I want to start by taking you on a reporting trip that I made to a village right on the border of the quarantine zone about 3 days after that lockdown was imposed, the village of Weiji in the province of Henan. What was that like? So arriving at the airport, very jumpy, a completely empty plane. There were 2 people on the plane apart from the crew. The police immediately picked me up because I had a press visa when I landed, immediately wanted to know what I was doing. I said, look, it's legal for me to come and see the virus lockdown you've put in place here. They came and talked to my driver, got his number. They were calling him for the rest of the day, basically trying to persuade him to cut my day short and bring me back to the airport. Driving down the country road towards the border with Hubei, this province of 60 million people that is now cut off from the rest of the world, every village entrance on the country road down to the frontier had a pile of mud that the farmers and peasants had kind of, with a tractor or something, made a kind of earth berm. We'd often have something like a kind of a village party, Communist Party committee would have lent one of their wooden office desks. You'd have a bunch of old guys with pitchforks and machetes sitting at a kind of desk at the entrance to the village blocked by a berm. Anyone from out of the village was not allowed in. Remember also that it was Chinese New Year, which is their kind of Thanksgiving and Christmas rolled into one. It's the time of year when tens of millions of Chinese migrant workers, it's their one trip home of the year to see often their parents, sometimes their kids who have been left in the village with grandparents. So there were tens of millions of people who normally work in big cities back in their home villages for Chinese New Year at precisely the moment that the virus hit. The village where I went, Weiji, right on the border with Hubei. So you had massive police checkpoints about a kind of a kilometer or 2 down the road with these kind of spaceman figures in hazmat suits, basically blocking everyone, taking everyone's temperatures. Where I was close enough to Wuhan and Hubei that about a couple of hundred people in that village of maybe 2,000-3,000 had come for Chinese New Year back from jobs in Wuhan. These would be people doing things like delivering food on scooters or working as cleaners in office buildings or in factories. So because they had come from Wuhan, they'd been identified by the lowest level of the Communist Party committee in their village, and they had to stay indoors. They'd been told they couldn't see their own family, they couldn't see neighbors, they couldn't see friends, they had to have their temperatures taken twice a day. And they were basically locked down for about 6-7 weeks. They were not getting paid, during this time. They were living on their savings. After a couple of weeks, it got even stricter. So if you lived in one of those villages behind an earth berm, you would have maybe 4 or 5 houses, would be told, okay, between you, here is a paper ticket that allows one person from these 5 houses to go shopping, only food shopping, once every 5 days, and you can come back and share that food. Other than that, everyone was locked down, often, as I say, on no wages at all, for weeks on end. At the high point, we think there were probably maybe 500 million, maybe 400 million Chinese locked behind the doors of their homes, essentially unable to get out. And that strategy has medical consequences, it has economic consequences, and it has political consequences, which include and affect even now on China's relationship with the United States. So let's take those in order. The medical consequences, I think if there's one thing that I can try and offer as a kind of added value, because I'm sitting here in Beijing and I've covered this since it broke out and been out in the field and reported this, if I can help you to understand just how unusual China's virus strategy has been and just how exceptionally ambitious their plan is, not just to flatten the curve. You remember that famous flat curve? You see the graph where you try and lower the level of infections and new infections so that it never gets above the capacity of your local hospitals and medical system. China is not trying to flatten the curve. China is trying to have no curve. Now, the fact that China lied at the beginning of this for the first month, more or less, and covered up and withheld the genome and lied to other governments, and is still being very secretive and is still putting out a lot of propaganda about that first month, that's really important, and it has political consequences, which I'll come back to. But I worry sometimes that the fact that China lied at the beginning means that, in a strange sense, a lot of governments around the world stopped wondering whether there was anything medical that you could learn from what China did next, if there's any kind of public health lessons, because although China undoubtedly lied at the beginning, and although there are some numbers in China that no one can really believe, I mean, at a minimum, they say that no member of the People's Liberation Army has ever had the virus. That makes no sense. Every other military on earth has had it. No senior Communist Party official we've ever been told had the virus. That again makes no sense. And when this is all over, you know, certainly we expect those death numbers to be higher than they were being told. But what I can tell you is that when the virus was raging out of control in that epicenter city of Wuhan, a city of 11 million people, and that was really for basically the whole of February, we saw cell phone video footage of desperate, overwhelmed hospitals, of body bags in car parks, of scenes of kind of the police pushing back mourners outside hospitals. That leaked despite the best efforts of the police state and the propaganda machine here to cover it up. So I'm pretty confident, although this is a very secretive country and not in any way free for a journalist like me to report, I'm pretty confident that there are no other Wuhans going on now, because we would see them leak. Instead, what we can see is that even small provincial cities, you know, we had a cluster of cases up near the Russian border a couple of weeks ago, one near the North Korean border currently going on. These are cities being locked down because they have 5 or 6 new infections, not 5,000, not 500, 5. Because what they've done is a combination of kind of brute force and high tech. The brute force part is if you physically prevent hundreds of millions of Chinese people from meeting other Chinese people, you can break the chain of infection. People simply don't meet other people in order to pass on this virus. Then they have the high-tech stuff, which you read about a lot, which frankly is a bit more patchy and not quite as effective as some of the reporting, you know, these apps, the contact tracing and stuff. But it's that combination of the brute force locking the entire country down and that high-tech stuff that I think we can basically say there are no major outbreaks underway anywhere in China. Now that is a public health strategy that is really dramatically different from anywhere else except maybe New Zealand and Australia, which are taking advantage of being islands, that kind of eradication strategy. That has public health consequences, and it was basically adopted as a strategy for public health reasons. the short version is that China doesn't have a great healthcare system. All of those high-speed trains, the shiny skyscrapers, the space program, the aircraft carriers, that's China spending its money. But actually, China has not spent a ton of money on its hospital system, on health insurance. So one of the reasons that they had really very little choice to lock the country down in this incredibly brutal and expensive way is they just didn't have the capacity. So remember that city of Wuhan, where the outbreak raged for the first 3 weeks? They basically nearly lost control of Wuhan, a city of 11 million people. China has, if you look at things like intensive care beds, China has 1/10 the number of beds per capita that a country like America has. So they ran out of intensive care beds really fast. They shipped in 11,000 intensive care physicians and nurses from the rest of China, but still there have now been reports by Wuhan University, Harvard University, some very credible first scientific reports that things were so bad in Wuhan hospitals during that time when they were out of control that beds were only being filled because the previous patient had just died. They would take the corpse out, put a new person in that intensive care bed. So they decided at the top levels of the Communist Party that they could not let that happen anywhere else because it was a public health disaster, but also that it was against everything the Communist Party kind of promises, which is you won't be free, you won't have free speech, but it'll be stable, it will be safe. So they launched this extraordinary national mobilization where these hundreds of millions of Chinese were locked indoors, including every time I did a field trip, I would have to come back and 2 weeks of quarantine here in my apartment. So I also did, my weeks of quarantine, literally not allowed to leave the house. That did work. It doesn't, I don't think, excuse the cover up at the beginning, but they did achieve something remarkable, which is to eradicate essentially this virus in a country of 1.4 billion people. Now, that has public health consequences because they cannot afford to let that happen again. So the reason I think that the borders remain closed, the reason that these small cities get locked down again for 5 or 6 cases is because they just don't want to have exponential growth ever again. So I spoke to a very smart epidemiologist in Hong Kong who works for the Chinese government, who said this very, very simple, but I think very illuminating thing. He said, really what China is doing right now is it's a bet on getting a vaccine quite soon. And if there is a functioning, working, effective vaccine by, say, the end of the year, and China really has had a tiny fraction of the number of deaths of a country like America, or in per capita terms, countries like Britain or France or Italy. If China gets a good vaccine by the end of the year, I suspect you will see them thinking, that was pretty smart. We took an enormous economic hit. Clearly people lost a lot of personal freedom, but that's not a high priority for the Communist Party, and they really didn't have a high number of deaths. So in public health terms, this very, very unusual ambition, this country of 1.4 billion people, basically still ready to lock down a whole city for a handful of cases, that is going to carry on until they get a vaccine. Unless we get a vaccine very, very late. If there's a vaccine in 2 or 3 years, then I think their whole strategy doesn't work because the economic pain will be too intense. The other thing it means, and this has medical, economic, and political consequences, is the borders are basically, as I said at the very start, are basically still closed. Now, in theory, Chinese people can come back in, but in practice, there are hardly any flights because the Chinese government is so keen to limit new infections from outside where the virus is still raging, that basically every airline gets to send 1 flight a week to 1 country. So you are seeing hardly any flights coming into this country. I mean, a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction. It's a few thousand people a day cross the border into China as compared to, tens if not hundreds of thousands on a normal day. So what that means is you've got hundreds of thousands of Chinese students stranded in places like the United States. They can't come back in. You've got a lot of foreign businessmen, families who can't come back in. The only people who can come in at the moment are diplomats. There's no tourism industry. The entire foreign tourism industry has basically been thrown under a bus. So that clearly has economic consequences. And at the moment, you can see China juggling with how do we reopen the economy? How do we get factories restarted when the borders are basically sealed to people? And also when the demand is not there from the rest of the world. So we have seen now those villages like the one I talked about at the beginning, where those migrant workers were eventually, in some cases, bussed or put on special trains paid for by the government to go back to those factories where they normally work in those coastal boom towns, because China was looking at an economic freefall and they wanted to restart the economy. Now we're hearing anecdotally that some of those factories have basically had to close again because there aren't customers. Because as long as the virus is raging in places like the US or Europe or in other bits of Asia, there just isn't the global demand. So we're testing, if you like, in real time, that Chinese claim to have become less of an export-dependent economy and more of a domestically consumption-driven economy. It turns out that if you basically remove external demand, this economy is still really limping along at kind of, at best, sort of 80% of its usual capacity. And that sounds good, but actually a 20% drop-off is really not good at all. So that is going to make China's economy very, very unstable for the rest of the year. And that's going to have political consequences. It's going to have domestic political consequences because famously, I'm sure you've all read and heard many times that the compact between the leadership in China and the people is that if they don't bother themselves with politics, then they'll be allowed to get prosperous and rich. Now, for the moment, the pain seems to be mostly focused on the lower end of society. We haven't had a housing crash. People have savings. People are coming, the economy is coming back to life. But if this carries on a long time, and the economy really takes a major hit, then that clearly starts to pick away at the stability domestically of the Chinese Communist Party. So that leads me to the final part of this, which is the external politics, the geopolitics. And essentially, what the Chinese Communist Party has done very shrewdly, some cases very cynically, is they have used their propaganda machine in the way that is always most effective, which is to build on around a kernel of truth, something that people feel or know in their guts is true, and then shape it. And so there is a propaganda story that has been told to the Chinese people by the state media, which is the only media we have here, which has worked, which is this story. You, the Chinese people, you sacrificed your freedom, you sacrificed seeing your friends and relations, you sacrificed, in many cases, a couple of months of salary. And you did that for the good of the country. It was a great national endeavor. There was this language around this is a war, a people's war against this devil virus. And Xi Jinping, the Communist Party leader, the supreme leader, was the commander-in-chief of this people's war. And I went out to those villages when they were on the strictest lockdown. And I can tell you that although people were suffering, they were locked up, they were not earning any money, that idea of being mobilized in a people's war did give people the feeling that they were being useful, that they were somehow had a bit of control over this very frightening situation. Remember too, that in Asia, they had a very dangerous virus, the SARS virus in 2003 and 2004, which killed 10% of the people who contracted it. So the memory of SARS meant that people were very willing here to really sacrifice a lot of freedoms because they were frightened of COVID in a way that I think has not been true outside Asia, because people don't have that memory of a virus that can kill 10% of the people that contract it. So at the very beginning of this period, you remember we had the cover-up. You'll have all remembered the stories in your newspapers about there were various doctors in Wuhan who were trying to warn their friends and their colleagues and their families that there was this new virus that looked a bit like SARS coming back. They were visited by the police, made to sign these humiliating confessions that they had made up a rumor that they wouldn't repeat it. And then in one famous case, a young doctor in his 30s, an ophthalmologist called Li Wenliang, who had been punished by the police for telling friends and colleagues about this virus, he contracted it from a patient because they were not being told how dangerous this virus was. So he wore no protective gear at all. And the fluids in the eye of a patient infected him, and he died in February. And you'll remember this, that Li Wenliang became a martyr. And that was really an extraordinary moment because hundreds of millions of people on the Chinese internet, when the news broke that this young doctor, Li Wenliang, had died of the virus that he had tried to warn about, were not just mourning him, but they were making explicitly political comments on the internet. And there were so many of these that the normally extremely effective censorship either decided to let it run for a bit for a sort of safety valve effect, or they just couldn't keep up. But for an extraordinary period of maybe 24, 36 hours, people who hardly ever have a political thought or who choose not to have a political thought were making explicitly political comments about how, what sort of society have we agreed to, that a man like Li Wenliang is now dead because he didn't have free speech. Why don't we have free speech? That was an extraordinary challenge to the Communist Party. Now, here we are, nearly in the middle of June. That sense of danger and threat to the central leadership of the Communist Party has all but evaporated. Li Wenliang, he's basically not forgotten, but that idea of anger at the government has basically been replaced. Replaced by what? Replaced by a story that the rest of the world, and above all the United States, have completely failed to control this virus. And not just failed to control this virus, that in failing to prepare, they somehow betrayed that sacrifice of the Chinese people. The story that people are told here, and I'm afraid there is a kernel of truth to this, is that the Chinese people locked themselves away behind closed doors in order to break the chain of infection of this virus. And what they're then told is that this should have bought time for rich world Western governments in Europe or the US, and that in some cases, in Britain, and certainly as they're told here in the United States, that time bought for the world by the Chinese people's sacrifice was squandered, but they did nothing to prepare. And that now these rich countries with all of their hospitals and their intensive care beds don't seem to care about how many people are dying. And that's one of the biggest things that you hear here from ordinary Chinese, is they're not just kind of shocked by the death toll in the United States, and they're not just shocked when they see state media just broadcasting President Trump at a press conference seeming not to care about the death toll, or seeming to tell people to sort of inject bleach, or seeming to want to talk about his own TV ratings, or all the things that are carefully edited and presented to the Chinese people through the state media. They're baffled. They know that China is a much poorer country. They know that the United States is the richest country in the world with the best hospitals in the world, and yet it has 2 million cases, and it has all of these dead, and that the political classes don't seem to care. So the story that is told here is that America is too selfish and too individualistic and too spoilt and too racist to care about the dead, because the dead are poor and non-white. And that story is taking all of the heat off the Chinese Communist Party leadership. And it's being hammered and hammered home that this is proof that democracies are decadent and tired, and they're about the rich and the elites running the place for their own benefit, and not caring about the single most important basic role of the state, which is to keep its people safe. And that story is really resonating at the moment with the Chinese people. Now, the final part of this, because I want to go into the questions, is the geopolitical consequences of this. So China is telling its people that they did this amazing thing together, this people's war that they won against the virus. They're continuing to take a big economic hit to prevent new infections. They're keeping those borders closed, sacrificing whole sectors like tourism. Those hundreds of thousands of Chinese students, they have parents, some of them not far from here in Beijing. They can't get their kids home. They would be desperate to get their kids home from the US or the UK because they think that China is much safer, but they can't bring them home because there are no flights. So that sense of pain and sacrifice here being kind of mocked by the selfishness and the decadence, as China calls it, of the democratic system, that goes very, very deep. Now, that has geopolitical consequences because the Chinese people and the Chinese government feel that they have a tremendous success story to tell the world. They are in no mood to be challenged about those cover-ups at the beginning. They feel that they want credit and thanks and praise for what they did. And that demand for praise and thanks, and that paranoia and hubris that is kind of in the air, is weirdly making them very obnoxious. So at this moment, there could be a big geopolitical soft power win for China. They're actually picking fights across the board with their neighbors in Asia, with allies and partners, with Europe, certainly with the United States. And that obnoxiousness is kind of born of a mixture, I would say, of hubris, that China has done something amazing that the world should praise and thank and learn from, and a real sense of kind of paranoia and grievance that particularly America is trying to blame their own mistakes on China as a scapegoat. That is the kind of the fundamental message. And looking forward to the next election in November in the United States, this is the piece I'm just about to publish tonight, my column. I've been talking to a lot of reasonably senior Chinese people in the national security world, in in the diplomatic world, business, about how they see this China-US relationship coming out of this crisis. It's really interesting. There's a kind of bipartisan consensus, if you like, to match the one that we hear about in Washington. If there's a bipartisan consensus in Washington that China is more of a threat than we realize, and that China's rise might be at America's expense, there's a similar elite consensus here in China, here in Beijing, which is that America is a superpower in decline, and that Donald Trump is a symptom and a symbol and an agent of that decline, and that everything that the Chinese Communist Party has said about the flaws and the weakness and the corruption, the selfishness of Western democracies is being proved true in real time. And that is tying into those questions about the trade war and supply chains. And China is becoming more aggressive and trying to leverage its tremendous advantages that, you know, if you're a Western government, you want to buy ventilators for your hospitals right now, you basically have very little choice but to buy from China. And China is extracting diplomatic pain each time. You have to thank China, praise China. You have to praise China as if they donated the ventilators. In many cases, they're selling them for top dollar. So I think when this crisis ends, if we have a good vaccine by the end of the year, China will feel that it's basically had a pretty good crisis and that America has proved that its system is basically in decline and that it's decadent and tired. And China will feel pretty cocky. But I think there are risks buried in the middle of that. One risk is that every time I talk to a foreign embassy here, friends of mine here in Beijing who spend their time trying to organize flights in, get the permits to land a cargo plane, to pick up those ventilators, to pick up that medical equipment that is only made here. At the moment, they're sucking up to the Chinese in order to get that equipment out. But when I talk to my diplomat friends here, my ambassador contacts here, what they say to me in the next breath is, when this is over, if we get a good vaccine, we are never going to let ourselves be in this position again. How did we become so dependent on a country that is so willing to use its leverage in such a brutal fashion as the Chinese have been during this crisis? And I think the election in November in the United States is, I think, for the Chinese a bit of a puzzle. Do they want another 4 years of Donald Trump? Or do they want something like Joe Biden, which is seen often as a return to something more familiar before Donald Trump picked his trade war? I think that boils down to a discussion within the Chinese elite about whether in this year of the pandemic, is the decline of the West a cyclical thing and the West might come back, maybe if you get a different president in America, or is this irreversible? Is this a moment which historians will look back on in 100 or 200 years' time and they'll say, this is the moment when the West basically accelerated into a decline and was overtaken by China. So there are forces in here, in China, who I think would like to believe that it is an irreversible decline, that we're now at that crossing point. And like all crossing points, it's going to be turbulent for a while. So it's striking to me that people on the national security side of the machine here are quite keen behind closed doors on another 4 years of Donald Trump. And the way that they say it is that Donald Trump is busy destroying America and destroying the West. Maybe if they're lucky, he'll pull American troops out of South Korea, out of Japan. Maybe he won't bother defending Taiwan. Maybe he won't actually defend Hong Kong, because one of the oddities of China's view of Donald Trump is that although Donald Trump says that he's immensely tough on China, and although there are people around Donald Trump, like the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, or some of the people in the Pentagon, some of the people in the National Security Council, who definitely are extremely hawkish and want to draw the lesson of this year of COVID, that America needs to become much less dependent, much less reliant, and much more cautious about engagement with China. The Chinese sense among quite a lot of the elites is that Donald Trump is not quite like that he is not a conventional, traditional China hawk. If your definition of a China hawk is someone who takes a principled stand on things like human rights abuses, or the pro-democracy camp in Hong Kong, or the internment of maybe 1 million Muslims in Xinjiang, something Donald Trump has essentially never talked about. And so there's a sense that actually Donald Trump, for all of his kind of talk about being very tough on China, actually, if you believe that the West's decline is irreversible and the turbulence is going to happen now, then there are people who like another 4 years of Donald Trump, because that slightly suits them. Just bring it on, destroy the West. That's the very cynical view that you hear here. There's one final camp, that's much more focused on the economy. And they think that China has ridden as in some cases, a free rider really on the global trading system since joining the World Trade Organization in 2001. It's done extraordinarily well out of its role in global supply chains and in globalization. And so the more economically focused members of the elite here, they wonder whether maybe it's a bit too soon to want to decouple, to want to blow up that order. And so they could imagine wanting to see America come back or at least stabilize, because China can extract more profit and buy some time to become more self-reliant and to wean itself off dependency on, American semiconductors from Intel or its supply chains. They don't want to be vulnerable to America, so they would like to buy more time. Some of them, therefore, I think would like to see Vice President Biden elected, because he's seen as more of a kind of familiar figure who might go back to those days of commercial engagement. One final camp among the elites here in China is perhaps the most cynical of all, which is that they think that actually whoever is the next American president is going to be bent on containing and hurting China, that something fundamental has shifted in the relationship, and that officials at all levels of government in America are now bent on doing China no good. And as one person said to me, the problem with Joe Biden is that his people might be more competent than Trump's people, so maybe they'll be more dangerous. So there's cynicism, there's hubris, there's paranoia, there's justified pride. There's a lot of unanswered questions about how soon that vaccine turns up. Is this bet on a lockdown going to pay off? And then that's a final bet about the economy. If they keep up this level of lockdown for a long time, that is going to have a major effect on the Chinese economy. So that's where I feel we are in the middle of June. I hope that kind of 6-month journey may have been vaguely helpful. And I would really love to take questions from you about any of this or any other aspect of China's relationship with the world or with America.
So David, thank you so much for that presentation, and thank you for staying up late to join us today. We appreciate it. It is fascinating to get a firsthand perspective and coming out of China, so we really, really thank you for that. Also, thank you to all of our attendees and participants that are here today. We're delighted that you were able to join us this morning. My name is Jessie Herman. I'm the Director of Programs and Community Outreach here with the World Affairs Council of Charlotte, and I'm going to be facilitating our Q&A today. So if you have questions, there's a toolbar at the bottom of Zoom. You can click the Q&A button and submit your questions there. So we're going to get started today with a question from one of our World Affairs Council board members, Rena Arline. So outside of what we hear about a deteriorated relationship between the US and China, do you see any cooperation between China and the US or the rest of the world around vaccines, research, and medications that are manufactured in China?
It's an extremely good and really worrying question, because of course, one country on its own is not going to be the solution to finding something as difficult as a virus, as a vaccine for a coronavirus. And you're seeing a lot of multinational projects, but clearly there is also a race underway. People draw the comparison with Sputnik and the space race between the Americans and the Soviet Union in the Cold War, that the country that comes out with a good vaccine first will have tremendous prestige, but will also have tremendous leverage potentially, because they can then choose their partners as they start to mass produce this vaccine. Now, ideally, we would have a multinational effort to pool the resources of all of the best vaccine programs to try and work out which one is ahead, to try and concentrate all of the research and the lab work on that best program. What we would have would look a little bit like the global response to the Ebola outbreak in West Africa in 2013. That was led in that very familiar way by the United States. Remember, President Obama sent some of the best scientists in the United States. He sent specialist members of the military to help in West Africa. All the world's major scientific powers sent teams down there, and America played that kind of convening role that was so familiar really after the Second World War. And Ebola was this terrifyingly dangerous vaccine, but it didn't really take a global hold, and that was a fantastic relief, and there was tremendous international cooperation. Now you look at where we are now in 2020, not only is the President of the United States not sending American doctors and American military to the heart of the zone, he wouldn't want to, He's instead closing borders. He's just pulled out of the WHO. The WHO is not all Donald Trump's fault. I don't want to make it sound as if everything is America's fault and everything is Donald Trump's fault. The Chinese did not allow the CDC from Atlanta to send specialists into China. They're very keen to do this on their own. The Chinese did not tell everything that they knew to the WHO, and the WHO suffers from many of the flaws of the rest of the UN system, that it's easily bullied by major countries like the Chinese. And so the WHO, compared to where we were back in 2013, or remember the SARS outbreak in 2003, where China covered up the SARS virus really very shockingly for several weeks. It was the then leadership of the WHO that called out China and exposed what was going on, because they had a moral authority and they had political backing from around the world that is just completely forgotten now. So that is very dangerous. The final point on this is it's not just that we need international cooperation among the world's best scientists and governments. I think we're in a different world in terms of public distrust of experts, public distrust of science. And I think that one of the most frightening, kind of dismaying thoughts is, you know, one of the most advanced vaccine projects here in China is being run by the Chinese army, by the People's Liberation Army. And the leader is a woman major general who we see on, you know, Chinese TV in camouflage. When you add that to the anti-vaccine movements that you see across the rich world and the developing world, when you add that to the distrust of China that you see in the rest of the world, if the best vaccine is a Chinese military vaccine, are we confident that everyone in the world, certainly everyone in America who should take that vaccine, will trust it enough to take it? So it may be that actually we're only at the beginning of a kind of real crisis of trust and distrust.
Great, thank you. So anytime we have a program on China, inevitably we're always going to have questions about Hong Kong. So today's question comes from John Gallus, and it appears that China understands that the US is in disarray. So they see that this is a timely opportunity to advance a heavier security policy in Hong Kong. Is this the case? And what's your perspective on the situation?
It's definitely part of it, and not just the US. Their bet is that the rest of the world is distracted. You know, if you're a foreign minister and you know you should say something about Hong Kong, but the beginning of your phone call with your Chinese counterpart is to ask if that cargo plane with 25 ventilators can be allowed to take off tonight because it's needed. You know, it's hard to then turn to the talking points about the democracy movement in Hong Kong. We're seeing the UK being braver than we expected by offering potentially up to 3 million people from Hong Kong a pathway to British citizenship. The Americans, unfortunately, are not fully coherent. You know, if you listened only to the State Department or to the National Security Council, then America sounds rather familiar. It's talking about democracy and human rights and free speech. You're seeing Congress being extremely active. Hong Kong has a lot of support and sympathy in the US Congress. Leading pro-democratic campaigners have been kind of greeted like rock stars when they've gone to Capitol Hill the last year or so to give evidence. So you're seeing Congress passing this updated law that basically mandated the Trump administration or any American government to say that Hong Kong was still sufficiently different from the rest of China that it deserved to be treated as effectively a kind of a little Western ally that doesn't have to pay the same trade tariffs, isn't covered by the same rules when it comes to kind of visas and trade policy and all the rest that China is. So Congress passed that law. What happened a couple of weeks ago, obviously, is Secretary of State Pompeo said that China, the national security law that's being imposed on Hong Kong means that Hong Kong isn't autonomous enough to pass that legal test and so should be treated differently. So that's a really very familiar American stance. You could imagine, you know, a Bush administration or a Reagan administration or a Bill Clinton administration at points saying things just like that. But then the president has said different things about Hong Kong. He has said last year that these were riots, that it was China's problem, not his problem. The Chinese officials that I talked to are absolutely convinced that Donald Trump could not care less about the Democrats in Hong Kong. What he wants is for China to buy soybeans from farm states that will vote for him in November. Now, they may be wrong, they may be right, but that is what senior Chinese officials will tell even journalists like me from the West. So China is taking advantage of that disarray. The final part of this is China genuinely thinks that there was a threat, a kind of an attempt to have a color revolution last year. Those protests that you saw, I went down to Hong Kong many times, stood on those streets, talked to those kids. I don't believe that the CIA was whipping up those protests. I don't believe that the National Endowment for Democracy, which is basically kind of 4 men and a cat up in Washington, DC, was somehow the mastermind behind all of these protests. I think that's an insult to the people of Hong Kong. It's implying they don't have agency, that they don't have political beliefs of their own. I think that these were organic protests. But why did the Chinese leadership believe their own propaganda to a really striking extent that these protests were being whipped up by black hands from abroad, particularly in the States? I think it's to do with their very, very bleak worldview, which is basically might is right, that big countries tell small countries what to do, that individuals fundamentally don't have rights in the face of the collective will of a large place. So I think to simplify it, when the 1.4 billion people of mainland China saw a territory of 7 million people in Hong Kong defying the mainland government and believing that as Hong Kongers they had individual rights, including some written down on a piece of paper, that meant that they could defy Beijing. From the perspective of Xi Jinping and the other communist leaders, it cannot possibly be the case that 7 million people genuinely think they have individual rights that matter at all. That's a sort of childish fairy story that you tell children at bedtime. But don't expect a grown-up statesman to believe that. No, if you are the Chinese Communist leadership, if a small place is defying a big place, it can only be because another big place is in the shadows behind the scenes, pulling the strings. So they really believed that they had to shut Hong Kong down because it was a dangerous place where America might start a color revolution. And their bet is that after the huffing and the puffing is over, that actually those big American banks, those big British banks will stick around, that they don't actually care about those kids on the streets, that when they talk about wanting the rule of law in Hong Kong, what they mean is contracts being honored, not democracy or free speech or a free press, and that the world will stick around because there's money to be made in a place like Hong Kong. That's the bet they're making.
All right, and to follow up on that question, we have a question from Reggie Pretty. What is your take on the possibility that the UK is considering citizenship for 3 million Hong Kong residents?
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because if you're not from the UK and you watch the whole Brexit referendum, which in part was clearly a vote against immigration, and particularly to end freedom of movement from Europe, led by, let's not forget, Boris Johnson and his current cabinet, who are all kind of leading Brexiteers, it is a bit head-scratching to see that kind of government promising, the largest single admission of essentially political refugees that we've seen since, the Asians were thrown out of Uganda by Idi Amin back in the 1970s, and Britain took them in, and that was a much smaller number. It's also head-scratching because remember when Britain gave Hong Kong back to China in 1997, as it pretty much had to do because it had a 100-year lease on the new territories, and most of Kowloon and the rest of Hong Kong just wasn't viable without that territory that had to go back. There was a tremendously bitter political debate within the Conservative government of the day about how many Hong Kong people to allow to have full British passports. And the then government, even in the face of handing the people of Hong Kong back to the government in China, this was only a few years after the slaughter of the students in Tiananmen Square. That was seen as politically insane to try and have so many Hong Kongers moving. So how can it possibly be true that Boris Johnson is saying he's going to let 3 million in? I think that there's a couple of things that make me think that maybe they will let some Hong Kongers in. One is Boris Johnson has said it in such unequivocal terms, as has the Foreign Secretary, that it's very hard to roll back. The other is, I know Boris Johnson. I was at the same newspaper as him for a long time. I was writing pieces for him when he was editing The Spectator. It's always hard to know exactly what Boris thinks because he's kind of the distilled essence of ambition. But I've talked about immigration to Boris Johnson when he was, for example, Mayor of London, and I was writing the British political column. His instincts are to be open to immigration. He believes that great world cities like London thrive on being full of foreigners. He's proud of the fact that he has mixed ancestry. He's Turkish, German, a bit Russian. You know, he is the child of sort of a kind of multicultural background. So I think that although they did win that referendum for Brexit with the votes of people who genuinely were very anti-immigration, I think that in his heart that in some ways hurt him. And so I think to be able to prove critics like me wrong, it would be very useful for Boris Johnson to be able to say, you know, the Economist magazine says that we won a nativist victory that was won with the votes of anti-immigration people. No, we were always in favor of global Britain. We just didn't want Europe choosing who we let in. And so look at us, we are actually global Britain. We're going to let in all these Hong Kong Chinese, and they're very well educated, and they're quite affluent, and they'll be tremendously productive. And sotto voce, you know, most of them won't come because they'll come for a bit and maybe they'll leave, or they won't actually stick around. They just want a passport as a kind of safety net. So I think we will see some Hong Kongers being given citizenship, but China is going to get quite aggressive about it. China is warning Britain that Brexit Britain, doesn't have the luxury of trying to throw its weight around and should watch its step. And that kind of depends on what happens to the British economy as COVID recedes.
So we've got a few questions regarding the trade war. Who has the upper hand right now? Who has more to lose? And how has coronavirus affected the trade war?
So the trade war is kind of on hold because there's two trade wars underway. One is the trade war that has been brewing for 20 years, which has a lot of support in the rest of the world, which is basically a judgment by the Democrats and the Republicans in Congress and by a growing number of big businesses that China has actually become too big and too rich and too successful and too far up the value chain of high technology to continue pleading that it's just a developing country, that it doesn't need to obey all the same rules as everyone else, that it can practice industrial policy, that it can have a completely skewed playing field where foreign companies are forced to give their technology to Chinese companies, which are then so massively subsidized that, you know, even if you do allow more market access, they're not really competing against a Chinese company, you're competing against the Chinese state. So that bipartisan consensus that China has got too big to carry on behaving like this and needs to change its ways, that's been brewing for 20 years. And that part of the trade war was pretty intimidating to the Chinese because they don't want to change their ways. And so that was, you know, the agenda that you saw in the 301, Article 301 report into Chinese industrial policy by the US Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer and some other figures, tremendous amount of support for that in Congress. That agenda of telling China to change its ways did not appeal to China one bit. But to their great relief, they worked out that President Trump has a slightly different agenda. That basically President Trump wants China to buy stuff, and ideally to buy stuff from people who vote for Donald Trump. And so they carved the trade war into two pieces, and they offered Donald Trump a phase one trade deal that's basically buying stuff. Literally ships full of soybeans on the ocean as we speak, even with all the war of words about the pandemic, they're still keeping their side of that phase one trade deal to buy Donald Trump off, because as long as that phase one deal is in progress, and that's going to help Donald Trump get reelected, that's the thinking, then that phase two deal, which is that entire 20-year agenda of structural reforms that the US wants China to enact, and that frankly Japan and the Europeans and others would like China to enact, that's very conveniently on hold because they're fulfilling phase one. And their hope is that phase two never comes and that industrial policy doesn't come and bite them. Now, someone asked a good point, who's winning the trade war? I mean, actually, you know, it hasn't hurt the Chinese. The tariff part has not hurt the Chinese as much as some in America expected. The things that really worry the Chinese is some of the stuff that's being pushed by real hawks inside the administration to deny China, you know, those semiconductors that you need to make some of the high-tech kit that China wants to sell to the world. You know, that is a big problem for the Huaweis, for the ZTEs of this world, because they are still incredibly dependent on some very specialist American technology that America doesn't want to hand over. I think that even if Donald Trump loses the next election, even if COVID goes away, this trade war is going to turn into something a lot more like a kind of technological Cold War. And the reason for that, I think, is that technology itself is creating new tensions, because in a nutshell, the first American election I covered was 2004. And I remember, watching candidates in 2004 talking about how China was cheating, China was taking jobs. But back then, if you were in North Carolina at a political rally, people were talking about, we used to have a factory up the road that made furniture. We used to have a factory down the road that used to make T-shirts. Those jobs have gone to China. And now those T-shirts and those dining chairs come in a ship from China. That was a painful political discussion that, could energize an election. But it was just about stuff moving backwards and forwards. The thing that's much more complicated now is that China, not unreasonably, has got rich and well-educated. They want to sell us not chairs and T-shirts, they want to sell us airliners. They want to sell us medical devices that might sit inside your body and connect to the internet and feed medical data back in real time to a server somewhere. They want to sell you an autonomous car that drives your kids or your grandkids to school and sends data in real time back to a server somewhere. They want to build our 5G networks and our nuclear power stations. Now that's not a container load of T-shirts arriving on the coast of America, which was already a political problem about jobs. That's a transaction that requires a lifetime commitment of trust, because where's that data going? It's in my chest and it's sending data. Is that server in China? What does that mean? Who gets to see that? Is this airliner filled with data? Could the Chinese make that airliner crash at will? Do we know? And so you're seeing that the nature of globalization in the 21st century is not just about a container moving from A to B. It's about products where the real value is in products which are essentially a lifetime commitment of trust. And that is happening at exactly the moment that trust has completely collapsed between the governments of the US and China. So even if the trade war Donald Trump has been talking about goes away because he loses the next election, even if the virus goes away, I think that 21st century technological Cold War, that mismatch between the trust needed to have 21st century globalization and the total lack of political trust and ideological trust, that is going to be incredibly hard to fix.
So for our last question today, we're going to look to the future. American perspectives on China and President Xi are increasingly negative. So what do you see as the way forward? What is the future of our bipartisan relationship? And realistically, what do you think may be in the cards there?
So look, I'm a journalist. It's not really my place to give Americans advice, but my wife has a green card. My children are American citizens. I've spent 9 years of my life in America. It's a kind of second home for me. And it grieves me to see America being mocked and talked about as a kind of country in sort of an ex-superpower in sulky decline. So one of the first things that America needs to do is to recover, is to stop declining, is to start competing. I remember I said to a pretty senior Chinese official last week who was telling me about how America was gone and finished. I said, well, think of 1941. Just the day before Pearl Harbor, the America First Committee was pretty active, preaching isolationism. You had a very divided Congress when it came to rearming or arming. A lot of people actually had no desire to get involved in World War II. The day after Pearl Harbor, the America First Committee quietly dissolved, was never really heard of again. And you built the world's most impressive warfighting and scientific machine, and then really built the new order for the 20th century. Now, it's not 1941, it's not 1945, but America that I know is not just a static group of people trying to make themselves great again. It's an idea. It's about, welcoming the world's smartest and most energetic people into America and saying, congratulations, you're now an American. You're now on our team. What do you want to do for the world? That America, I think, is capable of giving China a run for its money, because all of the things that I've been talking about with Chinese propaganda, the nationalism, the obnoxiousness, the hubris, the rigidity, the paranoia, those are all things that are not good for a country that wants to be building our 5G networks. That, the bullying that the Chinese are doing at the moment, this, very aggressive, assertive diplomacy, that's not how you behave to countries that you want to trust you enough to let you build a nuclear power station or sell them an airliner. So I think that there are massive costs to the way that China is handling its rise at the moment. And there are real risks to those in China who believe that America's decline is irreversible, because America's been through tough stuff before and it's always bounced back. And as long as America is an idea, as opposed to a fixed group of people defending their interests, then I wouldn't bet against America. So that bilateral relationship is going to be very bumpy because China has a vision of where it wants to get to. But at the moment, the Chinese are being clumsy and aggressive because they think that America is kind of not competing anymore. So you could change a lot about how this turns out if America remembers that it's pretty good at dusting itself off and competing again.
David, this was fascinating. Thank you so very much. Illuminating, edifying. We learned so much. I want to say on behalf of the World Affairs Council, if I may, that we would love to see you in Charlotte at some point in time when conditions are in place. We would also like to wish to you and your family to reunite as soon as possible. It must be very difficult, and we appreciate all that you're doing there reporting from Beijing. Thank you very much to all the World Affairs Council members who participated today. We could not do this without you and your help. And especially a big thank you today to our board members for participating and whose leadership is what makes us go forward and do programs like this. We invite you to join us for programs next week. We have the president of Davidson College, and we have a fun program with samba dancing next week. So please do look at our upcoming programs on the World Affairs website, worldaffairscharlotte.org, and we look forward to seeing you next week. David, all the very best. Again, please come to Charlotte when conditions allow. Thank you so very much for your presentation today.
Thank you.
We're adjourned. Bye-bye.
All right.